There's a kind of cold that stops asking permission. It comes down off the mountains like it owns the land, and it takes what it wants: cattle, fences, the feeling in your fingers, sometimes a man's whole reason for staying alive. I've lived through 19 of those winters up here, and I'd started to think the cold and I had an understanding. It stayed outside. I stayed in. We left each other be. Then one February night, a horse stopped dead in the middle of my east pasture and would not take another step. Not for the rider on its back, not for the whip, not for the storm trying to bury them both alive. And when I went out to see what fool was dying in my field, I found something I'm still trying to understand all these years later. This is the story of that night. Of a woman who should not have survived it. Of a decision that cost me more than money and gave me back something I didn't know I'd lost. I'm not a good man. I want that said plain before I start, so you'll believe me later when it matters. But that night, for once, I did the right thing. Stay with me, it gets harder before it gets warmer. The dog heard it first. Old Boone was a mutt with one bad ear and no sense of loyalty except to the wood stove. And when he lifted his head off the floorboards and growled low, I figured it was a coyote working the calving shed. I almost didn't get up. That's the truth I've had to carry, how close I came to just letting the fire burn down and going to sleep, and never knowing what the storm had dropped at my door. But Boone growled again, and this time he went to the window and put his nose to the cold glass, and something in the set of his back made me set down my coffee. I keep a tally on the wall by the door. Been keeping it since my wife passed, a scratch for every day I make it through winter, like a man marking prison walls. It's a stupid habit, and I know it. Sarah would have laughed at me for it, told me I was counting the wrong things. That night the tally read 41. 41 days of a winter that had already killed 6 of my cattle, and one of the Peterson boys down the valley. A kid of maybe 17 who'd gone out to fix a gate and got found 3 days later curled up not 200 yards from his own porch light. Close enough to see home, and not close enough to reach it. That's what the cold does. It gets between you and the thing you're reaching for. I pulled on my coat, the heavy one, the one that still smelled faintly of the lanolin from shearing though I hadn't run sheep in years, and I laced my boots, and I took the lantern down off its hook. Boone was scratching at the door now, whining, doing that little dance he did when the world had more in it than he could account for. "All right," I told him. "All right, you old fool, let's go see." The wind hit me like a fist when I opened the door. I want you to understand what that country is like in a real blizzard, because if you've never stood in one, you'll think I'm exaggerating, and I'm not. The snow doesn't fall. It comes sideways, driven so hard it's less like weather and more like the air itself has turned to knives. You can't see your own hand at the end of your arm. The cold doesn't feel like cold anymore. It feels like burning, and then it feels like nothing, and the nothing is the part that kills you. Sound gets swallowed. Direction disappears. Men have wandered off their own porches and frozen 10 feet from the door because they turned the wrong way and the storm ate the light. I strung a rope. I'd learned that lesson young from my father, who lost 2 fingers and most of his patience to a night like this one. One end tied to the porch post, the other end paying out from a coil on my belt, so no matter how far I got turned around, I could follow the line home. It's a humbling thing, a rope. It tells you plain that you don't trust yourself out here, and you shouldn't. Boone plunged ahead into the white, and I followed the sound of him more than the sight, because the lantern threw maybe 6 feet of light and then gave up. The horse was standing in the middle of the east pasture. I almost walked into it before I saw it. It loomed up out of the storm all at once, a dark shape gone pale with rime, ice hanging off its mane in ropes, its head down and its legs braced and locked like it had decided it would rather die standing than take one more step. A good horse. A paint, I could see that much, the white patches invisible against the snow so it looked half erased, a horse being slowly deleted from the world. And on its back, hunched over its neck, was a person. At first I thought they were dead. Snow had drifted up against the windward side of them, building a little crescent of white along one shoulder and one hip, the way snow builds against anything that stopped moving, anything that's given up its heat to the storm. I said something, I don't remember what, some curse, and I grabbed the rider's arm and it was rigid, and I thought, too late, I came out here too late, and something in my chest went hollow. Then the head lifted. 2 eyes found me out of a face wrapped in a wool trade blanket gone stiff with ice, and they were alive, God help me, they were fierce and alive and furious with the effort of staying that way. A woman, younger than me, hard to say how much through the ice. Apache, I knew it the way you know the shape of your own hills, from the cut of the blanket and the beadwork frozen at her collar, and something in the bones of that face that the cold hadn't yet been able to take. She said something to me. Her lips could barely move. It wasn't English, and it wasn't a language I knew, but I understood it anyway, because there's only one thing a person says in that voice in that storm. Help. And then, with the last of whatever she had, she twisted in the saddle and pulled back the front of her blanket coat, and I saw why the horse had stopped. She was carrying a child. Bundled against her chest, tied there with a length of rawhide so she wouldn't drop it even unconscious, a bundle of hides and wool with a small face in the middle of it, blue-white and still. She'd wrapped it in everything she had. That was why she wore only the blanket over a thin dress. She'd given the child her own coat, her own warmth, everything, and kept riding into a storm that had already beaten grown men, because stopping meant the child died, and she had decided, somewhere back on the trail, that she would freeze in the saddle before she let that happen. The horse had known better than the woman. The horse had stopped to save them both. I have thought about that paint horse many times since. How an animal, with no words and no promises, had understood the arithmetic of that night better than the desperate human on its back. That another mile forward was another mile from any help. That the only thing left was to stop and stand and wait for the storm to decide, and hope. That horse stopped in my pasture out of all the frozen miles of this country, and I have never been able to make myself believe it was only luck. You can't stay here, I said, and I don't know why I said it in words she couldn't understand, except that the sound of a human voice is its own kind of rope in a storm. You hear me? You can't stay here, come on. Getting her down was the first hard thing. Her legs wouldn't work. She'd been in that saddle so long the cold had welded her to it, and her hands, when I pried them off the reins, were curled into claws that wouldn't open. I had to lift her whole body, child and all, and she came down against me stiff as a fence rail, and lighter than she had any right to be. Skin and will and not much else. The child didn't make a sound. That frightened me worse than anything. A cold baby that cries is a baby that's fighting. A cold baby that's quiet is a baby that's losing. I couldn't carry her far. I'm not a young man, and the snow was hip-deep in the drifts, and the wind was doing everything it could to put me on the ground. So I did the thing I've regretted and been grateful for in equal measure ever since. I looked at that paint horse, half dead itself, and I made a choice about who I could save. I'll come back for you, I told the horse. I meant it. I want that on the record. I meant it when I said it. I got the woman over my shoulder, and I found the rope with my free hand, and I followed it back through the white, one frozen fist over the other, Boone circling us and barking to keep us on the line. 40 feet. 50. It felt like a mile. Twice I went down and had to fight back up with her weight fighting me, and twice I thought about the Peterson boy dying in sight of his own porch, and I got angry, and the anger is what stood me back up. I've never been a good enough man to be moved by mercy alone. But spite I've always had plenty of. I would not let this storm win. That's the ugly truth of how I saved her. Not love, not goodness. Just an old rancher too stubborn and too mean to let the cold have what it wanted. The porch light came out of the storm like a coal held up in a fist, and then the door, and then the heat of the wood stove hit us all three at once, and the woman made a sound I'll hear on my own deathbed. A raw, animal sound of a body remembering it's alive and understanding, all at once, what that's going to cost. Because here's the thing about freezing that the stories never tell you. The saving hurts worse than the dying. I laid her down on the floor by the stove. Not too close, my father taught me that too. You warm a froze man slow or his heart gives out. And I got the child free of the rawhide first. My fingers so clumsy with cold I nearly cut the little thing loose with my knife. I unwrapped the hides. And there in the firelight was a baby, maybe 8 months old, gray-lipped and still. And I put my rough ear against that tiny chest and heard nothing, and then, faint as a moth against a window, a heartbeat. Alive barely, but alive. The woman was watching me. She'd hauled herself up on one elbow, and she was watching me hold her child with a look on her face I have never been able to describe, though I've tried, sitting up nights with a bottle, trying to find the words for it. It was terror and it was hope, and it was a readiness to kill me if I did the wrong thing, all of it at once, all of it in a face that could barely hold an expression for how frozen it was. A mother's face. There's nothing else on earth quite like it, and I say that as a man who never got to be a father. Warm, I said to her uselessly and mimed it, held my hands toward the stove. We warm the baby slow, slow, you understand. I don't know if she understood the words, but she understood me. She nodded one small stiff motion, and she let me take the child, and the trust in that, the letting go, was the bravest thing I saw that whole long night, and I saw a great deal. We worked over that baby for an hour. I heated stones in the coals and wrapped them in flannel and packed them close. I got a little warmed milk. I had a tin of it, sweet condensed milk I kept for coffee, thinned with water, and we got a few drops of it past those gray lips with the corner of a cloth. The woman couldn't use her hands yet. They were coming back to life, and the pain of it had her jaw locked and the tendons standing out in her neck, but she wouldn't cry out, wouldn't give the storm that. She just watched her child, and she watched me, and slowly, the color started coming back into that small face, from gray to blue to a terrible mottled red, and the baby stirred, and then the baby cried. I have heard a great many sounds in my life that people call beautiful. Church bells, my wife singing, rain on a tin roof after a summer of drought. None of them ever meant as much to me as that baby crying in my kitchen, because a crying baby is a fighting baby, and this one had decided to fight. The mother closed her eyes. 2 tears cut down through the grime and ice on her face, and she said something soft, over and over, some prayer or thanks or her child's name. I never learned which, and I turned away to give her the privacy of it, and to hide the fact that my own eyes had gone and betrayed me. That's when I remembered the horse. The shame of it hit me like the wind had. I'd forgotten. In the fight to save the child, I'd clean forgotten the animal standing froze in my pasture, the animal that had done the saving in the first place, that had known to stop when the human didn't. I looked at the woman, and I looked at the door, and I understood that if I went back out there, I might not make it back. And if I didn't, that horse would be dead by morning, and it would be dead because it had trusted me, and I'd told it a lie. I'll come back for you. You'll think it strange, maybe, that a man who'd nearly let 2 people freeze out of laziness would turn around and risk his life for a horse. I've thought it strange myself. But there's a debt between a man and an animal that carries someone to safety, and I wasn't raised to walk away from a debt, and something in me, some part I don't examine too closely, could not stand the thought of that paint standing out there all night waiting for a man who wasn't coming. The woman saw me looking at the door. She saw me pick the lantern back up. And she understood, of course she understood, it was her horse. And she tried to get up, tried to come with me, this woman who couldn't yet close her own hands, and I put her back down with a palm on her shoulder that was gentler than any gesture I'd made in years. You stay with the baby, I told her. I'll get your horse. She caught my sleeve. Her hand had thought enough to grip now, and she gripped hard, and she looked up at me and said one word in English, the only English word she said that whole night. And she said it so carefully I knew she'd been saving it, holding it in reserve for the moment she needed it most. Please. I went back out into the storm. Boone wouldn't come. He stood in the doorway and barked at me like I'd lost my mind, and maybe I had, and I said, somebody's got to have sense, I guess. And I shut the door on his warm, bewildered face, and I followed the rope back out into the white. The horse was still standing. I don't know how. By every law I understood, that animal should have gone down long before, should have foundered and frozen where it stood. But it was still on its feet, head down, ice-shrouded, more snow than horse now, and when the lantern light touched it, one ear turned toward me, just barely, just enough to say you came. I have never in my life worked so hard as I did getting that horse to move. It had locked up the same way the woman had, decided that standing was all it had left, and I had to get behind it and push and haul on the frozen reins and shout myself hoarse against a wind that ate the words. And Boone came out after all, the traitor, the good dog, came out and nipped at the horse's heels the way ranch dogs do. And between the 2 of us and the last of that paint's enormous heart, it took a step. And then another. We followed the rope home. A man, a dog, and a dying horse, inching across 40 feet of pasture that felt like the whole frozen width of the world. When the barn loomed up, I nearly wept for the second time that night, and I got that horse inside and out of the wind, and I rubbed it down with sacking and threw 2 blankets over it, and gave it what warm mash I could make, and it stood there shaking, alive, and pressed its big frozen head against my chest for one moment before I left it, and I stood there in the dark of my own barn and let it, and I was not the same man who'd sat down with his coffee 3 hours before. I don't know how to say what changed. I've never known. When I came back inside, the woman had pulled herself up to sitting against the wall by the stove, the baby against her chest, wrapped now in the good quilt off my own bed, the one Sarah made the winter before she died. I hadn't let anyone touch that quilt in 19 years. I looked at it around that Apache child, and I felt something crack open in me that I'd kept nailed shut a long, long time. The woman looked up at me. The ice was gone from her face now, and I could see her plainly for the first time, young, yes, but with old eyes, eyes that had seen things I'd learn about before the night was through. There was a cut healing on her cheekbone. There was a wariness in her that hadn't left even now, even warm, even saved, because she'd learned somewhere that being saved by a white man was its own kind of danger, and she wasn't wrong to have learned it, and both of us knew it, and neither of us said it. "The horse is alive," I told her. I pointed at the door at the barn beyond it. "Alive. Warm." She understood. Something in her let go, some last held breath, and she sagged back against the wall, and for the first time all night she looked less like a cornered animal and more like a woman who was simply, bone-deep, unspeakably tired. I made coffee. I didn't know what else to do with my hands. I made coffee and I put a cup down near her, not too close, the way you leave food out for something wild you don't want to spook, and I sat down across the room from her with my own cup, and Boone lay down between us like a boarder, and the storm screamed against the windows, and the wood stove ticked, and the baby slept. We sat like that a long while, not talking, because we had no words that fit in each other's mouths. But I'll tell you, some of the truest conversations I've ever had happened in silences like that one. She watched me. I watched the fire. And somewhere in that hour I understood that this woman hadn't been out riding for pleasure, hadn't gotten caught in weather by carelessness. Nobody takes an 8-month-old child into a killing blizzard unless what's behind them is worse than the storm. She was running from something. I didn't know what yet. I wouldn't know until the storm broke and the morning came and brought riders to my door, but that's part 2, and I'm getting ahead of myself. What I knew that first night, sitting across my own kitchen from a stranger the storm had given me, was this. 41 days I'd been counting, marking scratches on a wall, waiting out a winter and a life I'd stopped expecting anything from. I'd told myself I wanted nothing, needed no one, that the cold and I had our understanding, and I'd see the spring alone the way I'd seen every spring alone since Sarah went into the ground. And then a horse stopped in my pasture and would not take another step, and everything I'd told myself came apart in my hands like rotten rope. I got up near midnight, and I went to the wall by the door and I looked at my tally. 41 scratches, a prisoner's wall. I picked up the knife. I didn't add a scratch for that day. I stood there a long time, and then I did something I hadn't planned, something I couldn't have explained to you or to Sarah or to God himself. I crossed the whole thing out. Morning came the color of dishwater. The storm had blown itself out sometime before dawn. I'd heard it die in my sleep, the way you hear a fever break, the wind going from a scream to a moan to nothing, and the nothing woke me the way the noise never could. I'd slept sitting up in the chair with Boone's head on my boot and the rifle across my knees, though I couldn't have told you what I thought I was guarding against. Habit, maybe. A man alone learns to sleep armed the way he learns to sleep light. The woman was awake. I don't think she'd slept at all. She sat where I'd left her, against the wall by the stove, the baby nursing now, quiet and greedy and alive, and she had the good quilt pulled up over the both of them and one hand free and resting near the fire iron, and I understood without a word passing that she'd spent the whole night the way I'd spent it, half sleeping with one eye open, ready. 2 animals in a den, neither one sure of the other, both too tired to do anything but wait for light. I built the fire back up. I put the coffee on. Outside, the world had gone white and blinding and terribly still, the way it does after snow to the windowsills, drifts curled against the barn like sleeping dogs, the sky a low gray lid clamped down on all of it. Beautiful if you didn't have to live in it. Deadly if you did. I checked on the horse first. Went out through snow that squeaked underfoot, that dry, bitter squeak that means the cold still got teeth, and found the paint alive, warmer, cropping at the hay I'd thrown down, and it lifted its head and looked at me with those dark eyes, and I swear to you there was something in that look that a man could mistake for gratitude if he were the mistaking kind. I gave it more mash. I ran my hands down its legs and found no founder, no permanent ruin, just a horse that had come nearer to death than most and decided against it. I stood with it a while. I've always been easier with horses than with people. Horses don't ask you to be anyone but who you are. When I came back in, the woman had moved. She was standing, barely one hand braced on the wall, the baby bound to her chest again with that same rawhide, and she'd found her moccasins and pulled them on, and I understood at once what she was doing. She was getting ready to leave. You can't, I said. I pointed at the window at the white waste beyond it. You'll die out there, both of you, look at it. She looked at me instead, and in her face was the whole hard calculation of her life. That staying was a danger she could see, and leaving was a danger she could see, and she was trying to weigh which one was likelier to kill her child, and she trusted neither, and why should she have? A strange man's cabin in a country that had spent 40 years teaching her people what strange men's intentions were worth. I did the only thing I could think to do. I set down the rifle. I made a show of it, carried it across the room, and stood it in the corner by the door, muzzle up, well out of my own reach, and I stepped back from it and held my empty hands out where she could see them. It wasn't much, but she saw it. Something in her shoulders came down half an inch. "Coffee," I said, and poured her a cup, and this time I carried it close and held it out, and after a long moment she took it. Her hands worked now mostly. The frostbite had spared her fingers. She'd lose the feeling in 2 of them for the rest of her life. I'd learn later, but she'd keep them. She drank. She watched me over the rim of the cup the whole time, and I let her, and I busied myself with the fire so she wouldn't have to feel watched in return. That's when I heard the horses. Not one, several. The crunch of hooves in deep snow, coming up my track from the valley road, and men's voices carrying flat and hard across the frozen air the way voices do when there's nothing green left to soften them. The woman heard it the same instant I did, and what happened to her face, I've never forgotten it. Every bit of the thaw that had come into her overnight, all of it, gone in a heartbeat, and in its place a terror so complete it had gone all the way through to calm, the calm of a creature that knows the trap has sprung, and there's nothing left but to see how it ends. She backed into the corner. She put her body between the door and the child. And she looked at me, and this is the part that opened me up like a knife. She looked at me not with a plea, but with a question, a single terrible question, and the question was, "Which kind of man are you?" I went to the window. 4 riders, bundled to the eyes, rifles in saddle scabbards, horses blowing steam. I knew 2 of them. The big one on the gray was Cutter Hollies, who ran cattle over on the far side of the ridge and ran his mouth everywhere else. A man I'd never liked and never had cause to. The others I knew by sight, hard men, valley men, the kind that formed up into what they'd call a posse and other men would call something uglier. And leading them on a good bay horse in a coat too fine for the work was a man I didn't know at all. Town clothes, town softness in the face, but a hardness underneath it. The kind of man who pays other men to do his cold work and keeps his own hands clean. They pulled up in my yard. Cutter cupped his hands. "Hey, you in the house. We're looking for a squaw run off with a stole horse and a stole child. You seen anybody?" Stole child. The words landed in me wrong, crooked, and I turned and looked at the woman with her body wrapped around that baby, and I thought, no, that's a lie. Whatever else is true, that's a lie. You don't ride into a blizzard and give a stolen child your own coat off your back. You don't freeze to your saddle rather than let a stolen thing die. I've watched animals with their young, and I've watched that woman all night. And I knew the difference between a thief and a mother the way I knew winter from spring. I opened the door, not wide, just enough to stand in it, filling it, my empty hands loose at my sides and the rifle behind me in the corner where I couldn't reach it, and neither could they. "Morning," I said. "You seen a squaw?" Cutter again. "Run off 2 days back. Mr. Devereaux here." He nodded at the town clothes. She took his boy, half-breed kid, and a good paint horse. I let a silence go by. Long enough to think, not so long as to give it away. "Storm blew hard last night," I said. "Nothing living came up my road. I lost 2 head myself, found 'em stiff this morning down by the creek. Anybody out in that last night is dead and adrift somewhere. You want to find her, you want to be looking downwind of wherever she started, in the low ground where the snow drifts deep." I said it easy, said it like a man giving good advice, and it was good advice. It was exactly where you'd look, and that's what made it work. Nobody survived open country in that. The town man Devereaux nudged his bay a step closer. He had pale eyes, eyes like the underside of ice. "You live out here alone?" he asked, quiet voice. A lawyer's voice or a preacher's, one of those trades that's learned how to make a threat sound like a courtesy. 19 years, I said, since my wife passed. "Mind if we water our horses? Warm up a minute." And there it was, the real question dressed up polite. He wanted inside my house. He wanted to see for himself. Every ranch in that country ran on a code, and part of that code was you never turned a man away from your fire in winter. To refuse was as good as a confession. It said, plain as shouting, "I've got something to hide." Devereaux knew that. That's why he'd asked it that way. He'd handed me a trap with 2 jaws and no gap between them, let them in and they'd find her, turn them away and they'd know. Behind me, in the cabin, I could feel the woman not breathing. I thought about a lot of things in the 2 seconds I had to think. I thought about the Peterson boy dead in sight of his porch. I thought about the paint horse that stopped rather than take one more step. I thought about my wife Sarah, who'd have known what to do without a moment's doubt, because Sarah had been better than me her whole life and I'd never deserved her. And I thought about what she'd say if she could see me standing in this door with a mother and child at my back and 4 armed men in my yard. And I knew, she'd have said, "Don't you dare, Amos. Don't you dare let them." I made my decision. God help me, I made it, and I've never taken it back, not in all the years since, not on my worst nights. "Water 'em at the trough by the barn," I said, and I stepped down out of my own doorway, pulling the door shut behind me, putting myself out in the cold with them, in the yard, my body between them and my house. Pumps froze, but there's ice you can break for the horses. As for warming up, I looked Devereaux full in his pale eyes, and I let something come into my voice that I hadn't used in years, an old hardness, the hardness of the man I'd been before Sarah gentled me and before her dying ungentled me again. "I don't much take to strangers in my house. Never have. Man lives alone, gets particular. You can warm at your own fires. Valley roads 2 hours if you push." It was a gamble. It broke the code, and breaking the code was suspicious, and I was betting everything that my reputation as a mean, sour, solitary old man, a reputation I'd earned honestly over 19 bitter years, would cover me. That they'd look at me and think, yeah, that's just Amos. Everybody knows he's like that, and not that's a man protecting somebody. Cutter half laughed. "Same old friendly Amos," he said, and there was contempt in it, and the contempt was the sweetest sound I'd heard all morning, because contempt meant he believed me. But Devereaux didn't laugh. Devereaux sat his bay horse and looked at me for a long, long moment with those ice-colored eyes, and I understood that this was a man who read other men for a living, who'd built whatever he'd built on knowing when he was being lied to. And I made myself meet that look and hold it and give him nothing, just a tired, mean old rancher who wanted his yard to himself. "That's a fine quilt," Devereaux said softly, "for a man who lives alone." My heart stopped. The window. The quilt was near the window, Sarah's quilt, wrapped around the woman and child, and a corner of it, a bright corner, must have shone through the frost-webbed glass. He'd seen it, or seen enough of it to wonder. I didn't look at the window. That was the whole game, right there. I did not let my eyes go to the window, though every nerve in my body hauled at them too. I kept my eyes on Devereaux, and I let a slow, ugly grief come up into my face, real grief, because I didn't have to fake it. All I had to do was let it up from where I kept it buried. "My wife made that quilt," I said, "winter before she died. I keep it in the window so the sun don't fade the good chair." My voice cracked and I let it. God forgive me. I used Sarah to sell the lie, used my dead wife's memory to fool a slaver, and it was the truest thing I said all morning and the most dishonest use I ever put the truth to. "You got any more questions about my housekeeping, or can a man grieve in peace?" Something shifted in Devereaux's face. Not belief, exactly. But the doubt had gone in. I'd given him a story that fit. A sad old widower and his dead wife's quilt in the window, and it was a better story than a stranger hiding fugitives, and men believe the story that costs them the least trouble. He'd have to decide whether it was worth forcing my door on a hunch, worth the fight that would come if he was wrong, worth the risk of shooting a white rancher on his own land over a runaway squaw and a half-breed child that I'd wager he didn't want half so bad as he wanted to make an example of. He decided it wasn't. "Break ice for your horses, boys," he said without taking his eyes off me. "Then we ride the low ground like the man says." And to me, still soft, "You'll let us know if she turns up, dead or otherwise. There's money in it." "There's money in a lot of things," I said. "I'll keep my eyes open." They watered the horses. It took 10 years off my life, watching them move around my yard, one of them walking right past the window. But the frost had thickened. Or the angle was wrong, or God for once was paying attention, and he didn't stop, didn't look. And then they mounted up and they rode back down my track toward the valley road and the low ground where I'd sent them, where they'd waste the whole short day finding nothing. And I stood in my freezing yard and watched them go until the last of them was a black speck swallowed by all that white. Then my legs gave out and I sat down in the snow. I don't mind telling it. I sat down right there in the drift and I shook, and it wasn't the cold. It was everything I'd been holding, all of it letting go at once. I'd lied to 4 armed men. I'd broken the code. I'd used Sarah, and if I'd read Devereaux wrong, if he'd forced the door, there'd have been killing in my house, because I knew, sitting there in the snow, that I would have gone for that rifle in the corner. That I would have. For a woman whose name I didn't know and a child that wasn't mine. Some line had gotten crossed in me overnight that I hadn't known was there to cross, and I sat in the snow, and I shook, and I understood that I was in this now, all the way, past any safe turning back. When I finally came in, the woman was standing in the middle of the room with the fire iron in her hand. Not raised, just held. Held down at her side, ready, and she was looking at me, and I understood that she'd heard all of it, hadn't understood the words, but had understood the shape of it, the men, the danger, the leaving, and she'd stood there through it with an iron in her hand, deciding what she'd do if the door opened wrong. She'd have fought. This woman who could barely stand, who'd frozen half to death not 12 hours before, she'd have fought 4 armed men with a fire iron to buy her child 10 more seconds of life. I've known brave men. I fought in a war I don't talk about. I've never in my life seen courage like I saw standing in my kitchen that gray morning, holding a fire poker, waiting to die well. We looked at each other a long time. Then slow so she could see me do it, I went to the corner and I picked up the rifle. Her whole body went tight, and I turned it around in my hands and I held it out to her, offered it, but first, the way you hand a weapon to someone you've decided to trust with your life. She stared at it, then at me. Then very slowly she set the fire iron down on the hearth, but she didn't take the rifle. She looked at it and she looked at me holding it out, and something moved across her face that I can only call understanding, that the offer meant more than the object, that I was handing her the power to kill me if she chose, and telling her without a word we shared, "You're safe here. You decide, not me." She shook her head, she wouldn't take it. But she came forward 1 step, and she reached out and pushed the barrel gently down toward the floor, and she left her hand there a moment on the cold metal near my hand, not touching me, but close, and it was the first thing either of us had chosen to do rather than been forced to, and it undid me. "Amos," I said. I put my hand on my own chest. "Amos." She watched my mouth, then she touched her own chest. "Nasha," she said. And that was the beginning of the part I don't have good words for. 2 people, no shared tongue, 1 long white winter closing back and outside, learning each other a word at a time. She taught me her son's name that afternoon. She said it soft against his hair, kitsch and pointed, and I said it back wrong, and she almost smiled, the first almost smile, and corrected me. I taught her the words for fire, for water, for horse, for bread. We drew in the ash on the hearthstone. She drew a mountain and pointed south, and drew little figures, and drew a line through them. And I understood, the way you understand these things, that whatever was south of here was the thing she was running from, the thing that had a name like Devereaux and pale eyes like the underside of ice. I didn't press it. There'd be time. The storm was coming back. I could feel it in the drop of the light, in the way the horses got restless, and no one was going anywhere for days, and that suited me. Let the low ground swallow Devereaux's search. Let the snow close the roads. Let the world forget for a while that this cabin was here. That night I gave them my bed. I'd sleep in the chair, I told her with gestures, and she argued, God help me. She argued with a man in a language he didn't speak about who should sleep where, and I won only because I was too stubborn to lose and she was too tired to keep at it. She took the bed with Kitch. I took the chair. Boone couldn't decide who to lie with and ended up on the floor between us again, our border dog, our little bridge. I sat up late feeding the fire, and I got out the bottle I keep for hard nights, and I poured one, and then I looked at it, and I looked at the woman and child asleep in my dead wife's bed under my dead wife's quilt, and I poured the whiskey back in the bottle, and I put the cork in it, and I set it on the high shelf, and I didn't touch it. First night in longer than I'll admit that I faced the dark sober by choice. Because for the first time in 19 years, there was something in my house worth being awake for. I thought Devereaux was gone. I thought I'd won. I want to tell you I was right, but you've been kind enough to sit with an old man's story this far, and I won't lie to you the way I lied to Cutter Hollies in my yard. Devereaux was not the kind of man who lost a thing and let it go. He was the kind of man who went away to make you think you'd won, and came back when you'd let your guard down, with more men and a warrant with a judge's name on it, and the whole weight of a law that had never once in its life been on the side of a woman like Nasha. He'd seen the quilt, he'd remember the quilt. And in 11 days, when the roads cleared, He'd come back up my track to see for himself what a man who lived alone was doing with a fine quilt in his window and a light in it late at night. And by then, I'd have a choice to make that maid lying in my doorway look easy. But the fire was warm that night, the child was breathing, the woman was safe. I let myself have that, just the one warm night before the rest of it came. 11 days is a long time when you're waiting for the world to remember you exist. We spent them like people who knew the clock was running and had decided not to look at it. The second storm came and buried us deeper, and then a hard, bright cold clamped down after it, the kind that cracks the trees at night with a sound like rifle shots. And the three of us, 4, counting Boone, lived inside the small, warm world of that cabin while the big cold one waited outside the door. I learned her in those 11 days. Nasha. I learned the way she held herself very still when she was thinking, and the way she came awake all at once, hand already moving toward the child from any sound in the night. I learned she was a better shot than me. I took her out back on the 4th day, when I judged the search called off, and let her try the rifle, and she put 3 bottles off a fence rail while I was still talking, and looked at me sidelong with the second real smile I'd earned off her, a smile that had some mischief in it. Some of the young woman she must have been before whatever happened to her happened. I learned she sang to Kitch low in the mornings, songs with a shape I didn't know, and that I started waking early just to lie in the chair with my eyes shut and listen. I learned her story too, in pieces, in ash drawings and gestures, and the handful of shared words we'd built between us like 2 people building a bridge from both banks toward the middle. Devereaux had bought her. That's the plain, ugly word for it, though he'd have used a prettier one, a debt, a marriage that wasn't, a contract signed in a language she couldn't read. Her people had been pushed off their land and broken up and scattered, and a girl alone in that country had a value to a certain kind of man, and Devereaux was that kind. Kitch was his son. And when Nasha understood that Devereaux meant to keep the boy and be rid of her, send her back or worse, and raise the child to be ashamed of the half of him that was her, she'd taken the horse and the boy and ridden north into the teeth of winter, because a chance of dying free was worth more to her than the certainty of living like that. I understood it. God help me, I understood it all the way down. And somewhere in those 11 days, the understanding stopped being about her and started being about me, about what I was going to do, because I knew, the way you know a storm is coming from the ache in an old break, that Devereaux was going to come back. He came on the 12th day. I saw them from the ridge where I'd gone to check a fence, a line of riders on the valley road, more than before 6, 7, moving slow and deliberate up toward my track. And even at that distance I knew the fine coat, the good bay horse, the way he sat a saddle like he owned the ground under it. And riding beside him, on a mule in a black coat, a man with a satchel, a man who carried papers. Devereaux hadn't come to search this time. He'd come with the law. I rode back down hard. I came into that cabin with the cold still on me, and I must have had a look, because Nasha was on her feet before I got the door shut, the child up, the old readiness snapping back into her like it had never left. I had maybe an hour. Here is the decision I want to tell you about, the heavy one, the one I've turned over on every bad night of the years since, looking for the place I could have done it different and never finding one. I could hide her. There was the root cellar and there was the loft and there was the country behind the cabin, but the country would kill them in this cold, and the cellar and loft were the first places a searching man looks. I could fight. 7 men and me alone, and a woman with a rifle and a baby at her back. That wasn't a fight. That was a way of getting all of us killed and the child taken anyhow. I could run them both off, right now north on the paint and my own good horse. But the tracks would show plain in the fresh snow and they'd be run down before dark. And Nasha knew it, and I knew it. And we looked at each other and threw that plan away without a word. Or I could do the thing I did. I want to lay it out honest, because I've heard men tell stories like this one and always they come out the hero. Always they face down the villain and win clean, and it makes a fine story and it is a lie. And I promised you at the start I wouldn't lie to you the way I lied to Cutter Hollies. I didn't win clean. I'm not sure I won at all. When Devereaux rode into my yard with 6 armed men and a federal marshal holding a warrant, Nasha and Kitch were not in the house. They were a mile off in the old line shack up the draw, the one my father built, the one nobody living knew about but me. I'd walked her up there in the dark before dawn, through a route along the frozen creek where the running water underneath had kept the snow from holding a track. And I'd left her there with the rifle and the food and a fire she was to keep small and smokeless. And I'd made her understand, with the last of our bridge of words, that if I did not come back by the second morning, she was to go north and not look back and not come looking for me. And then I'd come home and waited to lie better than I'd ever lied in my life. The marshal was a tired man. I could see that right off, and it was the one mercy in the whole business. That Devereaux had bought or bullied a federal marshal into a 12-day ride through killing cold. And the marshal didn't want to be there, and a man who doesn't want to be somewhere is a man you can work on. He read me the warrant. It named Nasha, not by that name, by a name Devereaux had given her, a Christian name that wasn't hers, and it charged her with theft of a child and a horse and property. And it authorized the search of these premises, and the marshal read it flat and fast like a man reading a thing he was ashamed of. "Search where you like," I said. I told these men before, and I'll tell you now. Woman came up my road in the first storm, half dead, baby half dead. I couldn't turn him out in it, I mean, but I'm not that mean, so I warmed him by my fire one night. I let that sit, let them think they had me. Come morning, she was gone, took the paint and rode north. I figured her froze in a drift somewhere, and good riddance to the trouble. That was 11 days back. You want to search my house, search it. You want to search my land, you'll want more men and better light, 'cause it's a big cold country up that way, and there's 100 draws she could be froze in. It was mostly true. That's the secret of a good lie, and I'd learned it the hard way. You build it almost entirely out of true things, and you move just one board. She had come up my road, she had been half dead. I had warmed her. She had gone north on the paint, every piece of it real. I just moved the when. 11 days back, not this morning. One board moved, and a woman's life balanced on it. They searched the house. They found the quilt. Devereaux went to it directly, of course he did. He'd remembered it, and he held it up and looked at me over it with those pale ice eyes, and I looked back at him with a grief I did not have to counterfeit, because it was Sarah's quilt, and it did carry a woman I'd loved and lost, and let him make of that what he would. "My wife's," I said. "You touch it again, papers or no papers, and marshal or no marshal, we're going to have a different kind of mourning." The marshal put a hand on Devereaux's arm. "Put it down, Mr. Devereaux." Devereaux put it down, but he didn't stop looking at me. And here is the thing I understood, standing in my ransacked house with 7 men in it, Devereaux knew. Not with proof, but with the animal certainty that one predator has about another. He knew I had her, or had her, knew I was lying, and knew he couldn't prove it, and the not being able to prove it was making something come apart behind those cold eyes, some rage he'd kept lawyer-smooth all this while. "You know what she is," he said to me, soft, stepping close so the marshal wouldn't hear. "You think you've done some fine thing, you don't know what she is. She's mine, bought and paid. That boy is mine. And you," he looked around my poor cabin, my 19 years of solitude and grief and the crossed-out tally by the door. "You're a lonely old man who let a squaw put a warm feeling in his chest. I've seen it before. It ends the same every time." I didn't answer him. There was nothing to say to a man like that. You can't argue a soul into somebody who's sold his own. They mounted up to ride the draws. And this was the part I'd feared most, because if they rode up the main draw they'd pass within a quarter-mile of the line shack, and if the wind shifted they'd smell the smoke, and if Kitch cried at the wrong moment, I'd sent them to the low ground the first time and it had worked, and I couldn't send them to the low ground twice without it stinking of a trick. So I did the hardest thing. I did nothing. I let them ride where they would, and I stood in my yard with my heart going like a trapped bird, and I watched Devereaux lead 6 men toward the mouth of the very draw where a woman and a child were hiding in my father's old shack. And I prayed, who'd stopped praying when they put Sarah in the ground. I prayed to a God I wasn't sure was listening to shift the wind, keep the child quiet, blind them, anything. And the marshal held back. He held his mule back while the others rode ahead, and he looked at me, this tired, ashamed man with a warrant he didn't believe in, and he said low, so only I could hear, "How long ago d'you say she rode out?" 11 days. He nodded slowly. He looked up the draw where Devereaux was already disappearing between the white hills. He looked back at me, and something passed between us, some understanding between 2 men who both knew exactly what was true and exactly what the truth would cost. "Cold like this," the marshal said. "A woman and a baby out 11 days. There's no finding a body till spring thaw if then. Drifts up that draw are 20 foot deep." He said it loud enough to carry, saying it for the record, saying it for whoever might ask him later why he'd called off a search. "This is a fool's errand, and I've a mind to say so in my report. Mr. Devereaux dragged a federal officer 400 miles into a death trap winter over a runaway and a horse. He gathered his reins. I don't work for Mr. Devereaux. I want you to know that. Whatever he thinks he bought, he didn't buy me. I understood him. God, I understood him. There's coffee on, I said. If a tired man wanted to wait out of the cold while the others chased their tails. I believe I would, said the marshal. And so I sat and drank coffee with the law while Devereaux hunted the hills for a woman the law had decided not to find. And when they came back at dusk empty-handed and half-frozen and Devereaux's fine coat rhymed white and his face a mask of fury, the marshal stood up and stretched and said, official as a church bell, that the subject of the warrant was presumed deceased, lost to winter, that the search was concluded, and that he'd be starting home at first light, and Mr. Devereaux was welcome to freeze up these draws till spring by himself if he cared to, but the United States was done. Devereaux looked at me one last time before they rode out the next morning. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. His eyes said it, I know what you did, and there's not a thing in this world I can do about it, and that's going to sit in me like a stone till I die. And then he turned that good bay horse and rode down my track behind the marshal south, back toward whatever life a man like that goes back to, and I stood in my doorway and watched him get smaller and smaller against the snow until he was gone. I waited a full day, to be sure, to be certain it wasn't a trick that he hadn't doubled back. And then on the second morning, the very morning I'd told Nasha to leave without me if I didn't come, I saddled my horse before light and rode up the frozen creek to the line shack with my heart in my throat, terrified I'd find it empty, that she'd taken me at my word and gone. The smoke was still rising, thin and small and smokeless careful, just like I'd shown her. She opened the door with the rifle up and lowered it when she saw me, and Kitch was warm and fed and fussing in his hides, and Nasha looked at my face and read the whole thing there, that it was over, that they were gone, that she was, against everything, against all the weight of that whole cold country, free. She didn't cry. I'd half expected her to, and she didn't. She just closed her eyes and stood there a moment in the doorway with the rifle hanging from her hand, and I watched 12 days of held terror go out of her body like heat off a stone. And then she opened her eyes and looked at me, and there was that look again, the one from the first night, the one I'd never been able to name. I can name it now. Took me years. It was the look of somebody deciding to believe, against all their own hard experience, that a thing might be true, that a stranger might be kind and want nothing for it, that the world, just once in one cabin in one white winter, might have handed her a mercy instead of a knife. We rode back down together, and I'd like to tell you that's where it ends, warm and settled, but you know by now I won't tell it that way, because that's not the shape a real life makes. Nasha stayed the winter. There was nowhere else to go till the passes cleared, and by the time they cleared in the late thaw of that year, something had grown up between us that neither of us had planned and neither of us quite dared to name. Not what you're thinking, or not only that. Something quieter and harder to lose. A man and a woman and a child and a dog and a paint horse in the barn, snowed in together at the edge of the world, learning that the small, warm life you build with your hands is worth more than all the empty country around it. But Nasha had people, south and west, what was left of them, scattered kin she'd had no way to reach and had never stopped grieving. And a woman doesn't ride into a blizzard to be free just to trade one cage for another, even a warm one, even a kind one. When the passes opened, she started looking south. I saw it in her before she said it, the way she'd stand at the door in the evening and look at the mountains, the way Kitch had started to look like the country she came from and not the one he was born in. I could have asked her to stay. I've wondered all these years what she'd have said. I think maybe she'd have stayed if I'd asked, and I think that's exactly why I didn't ask. Because I'd learned the one thing that mattered from that first night, from the horse that stopped rather than take one more forced step, from a woman who froze to her saddle rather than give up her child, from a marshal who wouldn't be bought. I'd learned that the whole of it, the only thing that separated a man like me from a man like Devereaux, was this: you don't own the thing you love. You don't keep it by holding on. You keep it, if you keep it at all, by opening your hand. So when she told me, with words now, we had words by then, a whole rough shared language built through a winter, that she was going to go south and find her people, I nodded. And I did not let her see what it cost me, and I gave her the paint horse and my good saddle and everything she could carry, and I drew her a map of the safe way through, the way that stayed clear of towns and men and the roads Devereaux might watch. She left on a morning in early spring, with the creek running loud again under the last of the ice and the first green just showing on the south-facing slopes. Kitch was walking by then, or nearly, and he'd taken to calling me a word that I never corrected because I couldn't bear to. She stopped the horse at the top of my track, where Devereaux had gotten smaller and disappeared, and she turned in the saddle and looked back at me standing in my doorway, and she lifted one hand. I lifted mine, and then she rode over the rise and was gone, and it was just me and Boone and an empty barn and a cabin that had been full and now wasn't, and a tally by the door that I'd crossed out in the winter and never started again. I never saw her again. I want to be honest about that since I've been honest about the rest. This isn't the kind of story where she comes back. She rode south into a country I couldn't follow her into and a life I had no place in, and that was right, that was as it should be, and I've never once wished I'd asked her to stay. But I'll tell you what I do. Every year, when the first hard snow comes down off the mountains and the cold starts asking permission of nobody, I go out to the barn in the evening, and I stand in the empty stall where the paint used to be, and I think about a horse that was smarter than the desperate human on its back. That stopped when stopping was the only thing left. That knew the way animals know and men forget, that sometimes the bravest thing in all the frozen world is simply to refuse to take one more wrong step, and to stand, and to wait, and to trust that somewhere out in the killing dark, against all the evidence of a hard life, somebody kind is going to come with a lantern. Somebody came for me, once, though I was the one holding the lantern. That's the part I didn't understand for years. I thought I saved them. I've got an old man's hands now and an old man's nights, and the winters are longer than they used to be, and Boone's been gone a long while, and there's nobody left who calls me by that word Kitch used to call me.